All right, radio listeners, today we have a very special guest in David Limbaugh. David Limbaugh is a nationally recognized columnist and book writer. You can find his website at davidlimbaugh.com. He's got a brand new book out called Crimes Against Liberty, an indictment of President Barack Obama. And David Limbaugh would like to welcome you to the Conscience of Kansas radio program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, very excited about this book. I've read it. I tell you, it's wonderful. I was wondering if you could tell our Conscience of Kansas listeners a little bit about why you wrote this book.
I wrote it because I'm fearful of the direction that Obama and his enablers in Congress are taking the country, and I believe that what he has done and continues to do needed to be chronicled in a thorough, comprehensive book, and I have laid it out in almost 400 pages and backed it up with almost 100 pages of footnotes. I think he's destroying our economic system, our financial integrity, undermining our national security, taking all the wrong, siding with all the wrong people, making the wrong decisions on social policy. I think it's a disaster, and I think if it's not reversed, that we will not be able to bequeath to our children the same America that our parents and grandparents bequeathed to us. So I think it's that serious.
And, you know, after reading your book, there's a lot of interesting books out there on Barack Obama. You highlight a myriad of things. One of the interesting things I thought about your book, and actually one of the things that got my blood pumping as an American citizen that sees that we got lots of problems coming from this administration, is the topic and the idea of the arrogance of Barack Obama. You know, when Bush was president, I didn't always agree with everything that he did, but I never felt like he was talking down to me or the American people. It seems that way with Barack Obama to the extreme. Do you agree with that line of thinking?
Totally. I go into in my book into some detail on his narcissism. He's arrogant, and he doesn't seem to be interested in what the people think. I mean, he masqueraded as a person who would be a servant of the people, and he ends up being dictatorial. He masqueraded as a guy who would be post-partisan and post-grievance, post-racial. He's the most partisan, hyper-partisan president we've had in recent memory. He engages in class and race warfare routinely. He's the most divisive guy we can imagine. And yes, he's arrogant, and he intends to impose his will no matter what the people think. He did it with Obamacare after he was rejected in the Massachusetts Senate election, which is a referendum on him. Scott Brown won. Obama lost. The other candidate was almost irrelevant. Obama, instead of going to the State of the Union address and saying, hey, I heard you. I'm listening to you. I'm going to move to the center. He said, hey, I want the American people to take another look at my plan. Then after, he continued to bulldoze it through and lied, cheated, and stole, bribed, promised judgeships, states, special favors, whatever, to get that bill passed. He said, I'm going to continue to fight for the American people. This is a triumph for the American people, when in fact it was over their dead bodies. So it's really unusual how detached and disconnected this guy is. When he spoke at the memorial service for the Fort Hood victims who were massacred by the jihadist Hassan, he did a shout-out to Dr. Joe Medicine Crow. And Toby Harnden, a British writer, said that there's a strange disconnectedness and a curious bloodlessness to this guy. I mean, he is a bizarre, inappropriate responses. He doesn't think the way ordinary Americans think. He's trashes America every time he gets a chance, saying we're dismissive and arrogant and a mean country. He married a wife who thinks America's downright mean. He went to a church whose pastor said GD America and said our chickens came home to roost when we were attacked on 9/11. He thinks we've provoked terrorists, that we did something terrible with our enhanced interrogation techniques, which he calls torture. So he publicizes to the whole world, including terrorists, what our interrogation techniques are, even though they've saved actual lives in the United States. So, I mean, I find it curious that we have a guy in the Oval Office and his wife who have contempt for this country, who doesn't seem to care at all what the will of the people is.
And he seems like a guy that's so disconnected that when we look at like the economic factors, when people are opposing things like Obamacare, and all the polls out there were showing that people didn't like it, they're protesting, they're marching on Washington, his response was, well, you just don't understand it well enough. And if I go and explain it to you better, you're going to find that out. And when he did that, I mean, Obama's just so overexposed anyway, people hate it even more.
That's the thing. You know, he has diminishing returns with his rhetoric, and he thinks that he he can go move mountains in Cairo or in Notre Dame with his rhetoric. He can change the world's opinion on abortion or magically heal relations between the Arab world and Americans of the Western world, whatever, with his rhetorical flourishes. And, of course, we've seen what happens in the polls. He's disfavored as much as any other president in the Muslim world. And he does not, by making more speeches, gain any traction, as you mentioned. In fact, he loses ground every time he goes back to the well and speaks. Remember, he said, I want to speak more to the American values, more to their values. What values is he talking about? He doesn't share our values. So
right.
if that's his aim, then he needs to do a little conversion himself and learn what the mainstream Americans' values actually are. Then maybe he could speak to them. But the idea that he just hasn't quite explained himself well enough when he gave 54 speeches on health care is pretty preposterous. It's pretty sad, and it makes you wonder whether he doesn't get it or whether he gets it completely and he's so cynical he can pretend that it's something that it isn't, i.e. that he hasn't explained himself well enough. I mean, really, it's a bizarre set of circumstances that we're witnessing here.
That's the big question. That is the big question. Is this guy just so completely warped that this is his view? He's completely cognizant of what he's doing, and he's doing it directly in spite of the will of the American people? Or is he somewhere in the middle of that and just full of all these yes men and these radicals that believe like him, like Pelosi and Durbin and Reid, that are just, he's riding that wave? I've tried to figure that out. Now, you talk about really strong-arm Chicago-style tactics that he uses, and, you address it, including, early on with Barack Obama's Turn in Your Neighbor program with the flag at whitehouse.gov. Is Barack Obama historic compared to other presidents in the amount of oppressive nature that he's willing to put on the American people?
Well, I don't think there's any question when we watched how he treated the automakers. He took over, fired the chief executive, installed his people, and did his reorganization, which involved discriminating against the secured creditors who are supposed to have priority under the law, and favoring the unsecured creditors because they're his union buddies, wanting to give them 50 cents on the dollar, and the secured creditors who are to have priority 29 cents. Flagrantly incredible and unfair. And then when they wouldn't, the secured creditors wouldn't agree, he threatened to slander them in public and called them out as speculators. He calls insurance companies, accuses insurance companies of making obscene profits, calls bankers fat cat bankers, tells his supporters that when the other side brings a knife to the fight, we'll bring a gun, says to BP, I'm going to keep my boot on the throat of BP, and declares war against Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, my brother, Jim Santelli, Rick Kramer, or maybe I got those reversed, Rick Santelli, Jim Kramer, Sarah Palin. It is very unseemly, unpresidential, and thuggish. We're talking about when Senator Kyle from Arizona asked that he consider putting a freeze on stimulus money that hadn't been spent yet. He had his 4 cabinet secretaries fire off letters to Kyle threatening to withhold Arizona's portion of the stimulus money just because Kyle had made a humble suggestion that we're wasting federal money, and it's not his money to withhold. He's acting like it's his money. I've never seen a guy act so lawlessly in the position of the presidency. They talk about Nixon. They talk about other presidents. This guy has no regard for the constitutional restraints that he's supposed to be operating under. He pledged $140 billion to the IMF for redistribution to third world countries. We're talking about 14% of $1 trillion, not even redistribution in the United States, but to third world countries. And when he was challenged on his authority, not just that he has no constitutional authority, but that the Congress had specifically forbidden him to do it, he said, I have plenary authority over foreign policy as commander-in-chief, so I'm going to do this anyway. In fact, it wasn't foreign policy, it was foreign aid. It was an Orwellian argument. So this guy will just say whatever he wants to say. He will dismiss cases. He and his attorney general dismissed a case against New Black Panther Party members for voter intimidation, which had already been won by default judgment against 2 of them. Dismissed it, deceitfully saying they had not had enough evidence to make, they didn't have enough evidence to make the convictions that they'd already secured. And it later came out from insiders at the Department of Justice that they had an unwritten policy not to pursue voter intimidation cases when white people were the victims and black people were the actors.
Amazing.
So we have an application of race-conscious justice rather than blind justice and equal protection under the law. Again, everything is foreign to our founding principles under this regime.
It's amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking to David Limbaugh. He is the author of Crimes Against Liberty, an indictment of President Barack Obama. You can find this book at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble's, all of our major outlets. You can find it right there at David Limbaugh's own website at davidlimbaugh.com and at our master website of superior conservative values at IbbetsonUSA.com.